everyone mute, please mute the YouTube, and we are live.
Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Clarke, one of the two moderators for our webinar today, and my co-host is...
I'm Deborah Thomas, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania and the Director of the Center for Experimental Ethnography. And we have the pleasure of co-hosting this session today. This webinar is co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of Anthropology and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research.
In the 2019 Cultural Anthropology Review of American Anthropology entitled "The Case for Letting Anthropology Burn," Ryan Jobson wrote that we need to abandon anthropology's liberal suppositions and adopt a radical humanism as its political horizon. This call for a renewed anthropology demands that anthropology eschew an exceptionalism that places itself outside its histories of violence and recognize with the way that anthropology as a discipline not only participated in particular exclusions to humanity, but also continues to presume a coherent subject that can be known, documented, and spoken for. Yet, with the COVID-19 pandemic upon us, the global call that Black Lives Matter, with institutions pledging commitments to addressing systematic racism and students demanding change from their university leadership, their professors, from themselves, contemporary anthropology could not be more suspicious for its enduring place in knowledge production, and a particular type of knowledge production. Following the metaphorical and actual fires that were part of the 2018 AAA meetings in California and that are part of this particular Black Lives Matter moment, this proposed webinar begins by interrogating the case for letting anthropology burn. And of course, it's an interrogative with a question mark, with participants insisting that this contemporary period demands a new intervention into anthropology's role in sustained inequalities. By suggesting that the age-old call for decolonization cannot simply be a course name in departmental books, the conversation today follows the call to engage in a decolonial challenge in which we endorse the type of scholarship that allows us to turn upside down epistemologies, knowledge practices, funding regimes, branding, and star systems that have come to constitute contemporary anthropology. It calls for a rethinking of the sole researcher for the realities of multivocality that demand that we redistribute power in ways that ignite a reorganization of anthropological theory and practice. This anthropological critique today builds on decolonizing efforts of the past, but in doing so, it also demands that decolonization of knowledge is also seen in substantive terms, but that we also consider the very structures and networks that enable or preclude our engagement in the first place. So the metaphorical burn that is at the center of our discussion today is ever present at this time and in this moment. But also present at the heart of this moment of anthropological critique is a demand that we move beyond the forms and structures of knowledge that continue to shape the discipline. And this critique is demanding that we confront anthropological inheritances, rethink them, and rebuild new approaches. And this includes new approaches to the study of culture and power, and that is the regimes of power that shape them. So what we're discussing today in the context of culture and power of the 21st century is an anthropology that takes seriously the focus of knowledge alongside institutions that render that knowledge both legible at times and illegible at other times. So we have a lot in store for us today, and we welcome you to this conversation. Before we begin with the substantive discussion, though, I wanted to welcome Professor Jason Throop, Chair of the Anthropology Department at UCLA, to offer greetings and welcome. Jason?
Yeah, thank you, Kamari. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. In these trying and turbulent times, I'm really, really heartened to see that so many have gathered together here virtually for this critically important event. I hear over 2,000 people signed up, which is really wonderful. This event is the first in our department's new multi-year series of talks on race, racism, policing, and state violence. I'm grateful to my colleagues, Professor Kamari Clarke and Professor Susan Slimovich, as well as to two of our graduate students, Abdullah Puckett and Zachary Mondesire, for their vision and for all the hard work they put into organizing this series for the year. Special thank yous also due to the Wenner-Gren Foundation for co-sponsoring today's event, and to Professor Deborah Thomas and Professor Kamari Clarke for moderating the discussion. I'd also like to thank all the panelists for agreeing to participate today. I think it's really going to be an amazing discussion. And I'd also like to thank our department staff, in particular Tyler Lawrence and Kate Royce, for helping to ensure that everything is able to run smoothly as possible for us today. Finally, I just wanted to announce in closing some much needed good news that's very much related to our event today. I'm very happy to announce that our department has just received a new generous $50,000 gift from Professor Robert B. Lemelson to establish the Study of Black Life and Racial Inequality Program Fund for our department. This fund will provide critical support for graduate and undergraduate students who share a commitment to the study of Black life and racial inequality in anthropology. Arising out of conversations with Professor Lemelson and CBLAC, a graduate student initiative, it's a collective and it's run and initiated by the graduate students that focuses on academic engagement, mentorship, and professional development of Black graduate students in our department. It's our hope that this establishing gift will help pave the way for more sustainable future support from alumni and friends who share our vision of impactful research in social justice related to issues of race, racism, and racial inequality. Accordingly, in conjunction with Professor Lemelson's generous gift, we're initiating a matching campaign for those of you who wish to contribute to the fund. For those of you who are interested, you can visit our department's homepage, and there's a little yellow give button up on the right corner, which you can click on. That takes you to a donation page, and you can kind of click what you want to donate to. And this initiative is called the Study of Black Life and Racial Inequality Program Fund. So on behalf of the department, I'd like to express our deepest gratitude to Professor Lemelson for his support of this vision and his generous gift, which will ensure the program's success in years to come. Thanks also to any of you who are able to help support this initiative as well in whatever way you are able. And thank you everybody, sincere thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks for co-hosting. I want to turn now to Danilyn Rutherford, who has been the president of the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research since 2017. Prior to taking on that role, she was an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Chicago and a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she was also the chair from 2011 to 2016. As the author of 3 books on West Papua, she has published essays and articles on kinship, Christian conversion, nationalism, sovereignty, missionary language ideology, Franz Kafka's In the Penal Colony, affect, money, technology, climate change, and the empirical nature of anthropological work. And I have always found her scholarship really great to think with, and sort of as a Caribbeanist looking at an alternative archipelago, she always inspires me to think differently about the imperial spaces that I'm looking at. Danilyn. I think you're muted still, Danilyn. Can you unmute?
Sorry about that. That was a rookie move. Thank you so much to the organizers, our fellow sponsors, and this afternoon's panelists. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to this fantastic event. I'd like to begin with some words from the introduction to a special issue of Current Anthropology based on a symposium Wenner-Gren recently hosted on Atlantic slavery and the making of the modern world. They were written by Ibrahima Thiaw, a historical archaeologist based at Ifan in Dakar, Senegal, and Deborah Mack, who is the interim director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, who worked together as the organizers of this event. They write, "The history of Atlantic slavery is tightly linked to that of European colonization of the rest of the world that went hand in hand with the production of Eurocentric knowledge. Hence, it is critical to interrogate how these legacies infiltrated the core methodological and theoretical foundations of anthropological discourses." Now, these words are well taken, but it is also critical to interrogate how these legacies have infiltrated the institutions that have sustained anthropological discourses over the years. Wenner-Gren is among them. Our founder, Axel Wenner-Gren, who started the Electrolux Corporation, was a Swedish magnate and a friend of Nazi sympathizers. The fact that Wenner-Gren was willing to use his money to support basic research in anthropology tells you something about the field. Equally telling is the biography of Wenner-Gren's second director of research and president, Lida Osmundson, who acted as a gatekeeper for the discipline between the early 1960s and the mid-1980s. Lida Osmundson was listed as Black in the 1930 census. This would have come as a surprise to the anthropologists who attended the meeting she organized. To become one of the most powerful people in anthropology, she felt she had to pass as white. We are gathered today to consider what it would mean for American anthropology to reckon with race and racism. At Wenner-Gren, this discussion hits close to home. The very existence of the Wenner-Gren Foundation is a grand historical accident. Neither Axel Wenner-Gren nor our co-founder, Paul Fayos, knew anything about the anthropology of their day, let alone the discipline anthropology has become. The responsibility born of the historical accident has always weighed heavy on those of us involved in the foundation. But we've never felt its urgency more keenly than now. We feel duty-bound to do what we can to protect anthropology and anthropologists. But we also need to make sure that anthropology is worth saving. In the words of the organizers, this might mean letting it burn. In my beautiful city of Santa Cruz, California, on the unceded lands of the Amamutsan tribe, this feels like more than a metaphor. Today, the air is clear and the ocean is sparkling. That Tuesday when the sky turned orange and the day never came is beginning to seem like a bad dream. But while some wealthy homeowners are filing insurance claims to rebuild their houses in the mountains, those castles on peaks Mike Davis described in his famous essay, homeless people are crowded along the San Lorenzo River and on downtown streets, driven from the forest where they were living. In anthropology as well, the disasters of these times are making the inequality and injustice that have dogged the discipline impossible to ignore. Anthropologists are being challenged conceptually, methodologically, but above all, ethically. It's no longer a question of what kind of research is possible, but of who has a stake in it and whether it's worth being done. Fires lead to destruction, but also to new clearings. There are seeds that only germinate when a forest burns. At Wenner-Gren, we've been thinking hard about the work we need to do in this moment of peril and possibility. In 2018, we came together around 4 strategic priorities: advancing anthropological knowledge, amplifying the impact of anthropology, addressing the precarity of anthropology and anthropologists, and fostering an inclusive vision of the field. Some of the measures we're taking were already in the works before 2020 hit. Our new Engaged Research Grant, for instance, that will support collaborative projects that empower those who have historically been the target of anthropological research rather than researchers themselves. And these grants will support research partnerships with the same level of funding as our existing research grants. The first deadline is August 1st, 2021. There are other interventions we're just beginning to explore. Some will target an exclusion I hope we'll be addressing here. It's worth thinking hard about the North Americanness of the anthropology under debate. We're honored to have an opportunity to provide a platform for thinkers like those gathered today who are looking hard at what anthropology is and has the potential to become at this critical moment. I'm looking forward to learning from you all.
Kamari, you're muted.
Okay. Thank you, Danilyn, and thank you, Jason, for those introductory remarks. And now we'll start by thinking about how these conceptions of burning and building can serve as both potent metaphors as well as ways to conceive new forms of practices that democratize our discipline in radical and new ways. And the structure that we have today is a two-part structure where we'll ask panelists on one hand to think about the production of knowledge and also to ponder what they've done to innovate in their own work. And so on one hand, the politics of production, on the other hand, how they've managed it in their own work to address these broader issues around decolonizing the discipline. And the goal is for each panelist to reflect and share on key and important terms or analytics that they use in their own work and in their interventions. And through this, we hope that we'll begin to share a common grammar for a much needed new normal. And so I'll turn to Deb now to introduce our panelists for today.
Great. So it's an honor to introduce everybody to you. I'll start with Lucia Cantero, who is an assistant professor of international studies at the University of San Francisco. Her areas of research include the political economy of Latin America and the Black Atlantic, aesthetics, affect, infrastructures, data, and urban ethnography. Her work focuses on branding, advertising, and markets as sites for the construction of political subjectivity and the ways this process inflects constructions of race, class, and sexuality. She's currently completing a monograph called Olympic Afterlives, Global Spectacles of Space, Race, and Inequality in Rio de Janeiro. And her co-edited volume, Precarious Democracy, Ethnographies of Hope, Despair, and Resistance in Brazil, is forthcoming. Ryan Jobson is the Neubauer Family Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. His research and teaching engage issues of energy and extractive resource development, technology and infrastructure, states and sovereignty, and histories of racial capitalism in the colonial and post-colonial Americas. Jobson is also a faculty affiliate of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, and associate editor of the journal Transforming Anthropology, which is the journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists. Chris Loperena is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His research examines Indigenous and Black struggles for territorial autonomy in Central America, ethicality and subject formation, extractivism, and the socio-spatial politics of economic development. In addition to his current book project, A Fragmented Paradise, Anti-Blackness and the Limits of Progress in Honduras, he is co-editor of two themed issues on the use of cultural evidence in the adjudication of Indigenous and Afro-descendant rights, one of which we recently published in American Anthropologist. Jonathan Rosa is Associate Professor of Education, Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies, and by courtesy, Anthropology and Linguistics at Stanford University. He is the author of the book Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, Ratio-Linguistic Ideologies and the Learning of Latinidad, and co-editor of the volume Language and Social Justice in Practice. His work has been published in scholarly journals such as American Anthropologist, American Ethnologist, Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, and Harvard Educational Review, as well as featured in media outlets including the New York Times, The Nation, NPR, and Univision. Savannah Shange is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she also serves as principal faculty in critical race and ethnic studies. Her research and teaching interests include state violence, late liberal statecraft, multiracial coalition, ethnographic ethics, queer politics, and abolition. Her first book, Progressive Dystopia, Abolition, Anti-Blackness, and Schooling in San Francisco, is an ethnography of the afterlife of slavery as lived in the Bay Area. We have another panelist who unfortunately couldn't join us today, but I'm going to introduce her anyway, because in different moments we will be sharing some reflections that she sent to us. Unfortunately, she's not able to be on the call because she's struggling with the ongoing effects of COVID. Zoe Todd is a Métis scholar and artist who teaches at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Her work engages science, art, social sciences, and indigenous knowledge to tackle the diverse, interconnected challenges of protecting fish in rapidly changing watersheds and landscapes across the prairies. Through her work in Indigenous environmental studies, she focuses explicitly on applying Métis philosophy, art, and law to reassert reciprocal relations with fish, water, and aquatic species in freshwater ecosystems in Canada. So as Kamari said earlier, in part one of the webinar, we're really going to ask the panelists to reflect on what it might mean to burn down the structures in anthropology and to rebuild them. And we'll begin with Ryan by asking him to draw out and contextualize his review piece and reflect on this a little bit. Following Ryan, Lucia will reflect on her reviews and thoughts. Savannah will talk about abolitionist anthropology. We may read some of Zoe's comments. Chris will talk about the politics of production. And Jonathan will reflect on how his analytics serve to rupture these structurally determining problems. Kamari?
Thanks, Deb. And in part two, then, we'll ask our panelists to reflect on what might be built from the ashes of those interventions in order to reinvigorate the production of anthropological knowledge. And so some of the questions will have to do with what the ways are of reimagining the object and subject of anthropology and how those practices actually shape knowledge practices moving forward. We also would like to reflect on how our panelists see themselves as working to decolonize this production.
So just a couple words on format. As you know, this is an online event via Zoom that's also being live streamed on YouTube. It's being recorded and it will be posted on the Wenner-Gren Vimeo page and also on the UCLA website. You can, and many of you already are, post comments and questions in the chat function on YouTube. We really intend this to be a conversation with panelists. And during the second half of the session, we'll welcome questions for the panelists, and Kamari and I will be looking at the comments throughout in order to call them to bring them into the more public discussion. So let's move on to part one.
Okay, thanks, Deb. So first, the first two questions, and we'd like to put Ryan on the spot since in so many ways his annual review piece really invigorated multiple sets of conversations that are happening in corridors and hallways and online and offline. And so we thought we would start by asking him to share with us, or helping us think about how burning can help as a way to conceive, or can serve as a way to conceive collectively new forms of practices that might democratize our discipline in radical and novel ways. And so, Ryan, then the first question for you then is, where did this metaphoric call and invocation of the case for letting anthropology burn come from? What were you thinking? If you could explain to those, especially those who didn't read the AA review piece, if you can give us some context and let us know where it came from and why do you see it as critically important in this moment?
Well, thank you, Kamari. I appreciate both the introduction and the provocation. I guess before I start, I wanted to thank both Jason and Danilyn and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for facilitating this. I wanted to thank you again, Kamari, for inviting me to write the original essay that sparked all of this. And I'm really just excited today to be in dialogue with some very sort of close and trusted friends as well as colleagues. So I'll be fairly brief because I'd actually like to hear what sort of they have thought about this conversation as it's unfolded, more so than having me continue to pontificate on many of the points that I've been sort of rehashing over the past few months. But before I jump in, I also just wanted to acknowledge that, even though this is the Wenner-Gren Symposium, it's co-sponsored by the UCLA Department of Anthropology. I just wanted to express my continued support and solidarity with the Cops Off Campus campaign at the University of California system, as well as the cost of living adjustment campaign by graduate students across the UC system. I was actually fortunate enough to join a national call with reps from Cops Off Campus last week and share a bit about our own organizing efforts here at UChicago to bring an abolitionist politics to bear on our own places of work. I think that's part of the sort of praxis that we're calling for. So I just wanted to shout out the student organizers in Care Not Cops and UChicago United for their spectacular work on this front. So just by way of answering your question, I guess I'll offer a bit of background on the inspiration for my essay. I've discussed this before in the interview that I conducted with you, Kamari and Lucia, but for the sake of our audience today, I'll rehearse a little bit of it again. So when Kamari invited me to contribute the Year in Review essay in March 2019, which seems so distant now, far more than the year and a half that I guess it was, the memory of the 2018 AAAs in San Jose was still sort of freshly imprinted on my memory, and not really because it was exceptional, which in certain cases perhaps it was, but rather actually how mundane a lot of that experience was at that particular conference. So the smoke was certainly unusual. That wasn't something that I was sort of accustomed to experiencing at the AAAs, but it seemed that there was a really strong commitment that pervaded the meeting to continue our disciplinary business as usual, in spite of the many crises that were unfolding in front of us. And I think that includes both the wildfires, but also sort of the sustained or latest episodes of US empire and authoritarianism, as well as even the hotel strike that sort of immediately preceded the meeting at the conference hotel in San Jose. And I remember many of the sessions were moved to this multi-purpose space where we really couldn't hear anything that was being said, but rather than sort of ceding to the absurdity of it, and we were sort of committed to yelling over each other and pretending this was somewhat normal. So I think that in a lot of ways, I just want to underscore how we push to continue business as usual. And also to point out that that was not equally accessible to everyone who's at that meeting. And that's something that one of my professors from my time at Yale, Karen Nakamura, has raised again and again, sort of the question of basic accessibility needs at the AAA and in anthropology. And I think really demonstrates in a very intimate way how anthropology has struggled to meet those basic challenges despite these sort of outward commitments to anti-racism and social justice. So this was all sort of with me as I was pouring through the scholarship that was published in Anthropology in 2019 for the Year in Review essay. And it occurred to me that we were being challenged by kind of parallel conceit in our own discipline to Mike Davis's original essay on the case for letting Malibu burn, namely this, imperative to place our own objects of critique at a distance while preserving this normative order of things within our places of work in universities and places of professional reproduction like the AAAs. So I guess what I'll say here is that it's been really fascinating to see the way the essays experience a kind of second life in this new or perhaps not unexceptional landscape that's dominated by COVID, by the sustained insurgent protests against state violence and white supremacy, and even the turn to these virtual platforms like this event here that I regarded as a kind of virtual fix in the essay that allows us to, again, sustain business as usual. So I guess I want to push back even here today on the way that this very event could be deployed as a very convenient fix for the many crises that both anthropology and our world are facing. So I'm really most excited to hear, actually shut up and hear what my colleagues have to say about how this essay resonated or did not with them, both at the moment it appeared in print, but also sort of how that's evolved in the months since. I've actually joked with a number of friends of mine about the irony that I was calling to let anthropology burn because I was exhausted by all the debates internal to the discipline. And now I found myself dragged back into many months of additional conversations around the future of anthropology and anthropologists like the one here today. So that irony is not lost on me. I guess I also find that this particular moment has drawn a lot more attention to the the piece of my essay on anthropology's liberal anti-racism and what I call the Boasian fix, despite that being kind of minor or buried within the original essay. So I think that's why a conversation like the one we're having today about what we do, rebuild or rebuild under the banner of anthropology, or if we do build anything under the banner of anthropology, is so crucial as sort of an adjunct of the question of letting anthropology burn. So I guess to kind of bring this up to the present, I've been thinking a lot about Rolf Trujillo's essay, Adieu Culture, where he talks about how the culture concepts began to enjoy a life of its own outside of its conditions of origin in anthropology. And I think similarly, whether we're its chief adherents or not in a moment like this, the kind of discourse of liberal anti-racism, which also in many ways was spearheaded by anthropologists, also enjoys a life of its own beyond our discipline and beyond the academy in terms of all the literature that's circulated over the past several months. So I think that means it's incumbent upon us as anthropologists to be really attentive and especially vocal about its limits, about what it does and doesn't do in the world, either productively or destructively. I think we should be asking whether liberal anti-racism carries us toward a politics of abolition against capital, against the police state, against the military-industrial complex, or whether it's actually deployed to stabilize an existing order of things, which I think would be sort of my reading of it. So I guess to offer up a quick thought as to what anthropology might become, I can return to Trujillo again, because he's very clear that sort of the project of Western liberal humanism emerges out of this construction of the savage slot. It's sort of the sort of, as he calls it, the Janus-faced other of the savage slot is utopia and the West. So exploding Trujillo's savage slot, I think, demands that we build an anthropology that's decidedly more capacious in scope and method. I'm not the first to suggest this. I think this is something that Trujillo said many different times, and one that really attends to the enduring violences of the present in dialogue with these colonial histories of violence that produce to use Sylvia Wynter's term, the genre of the human that we inhabit today. And I think, to invoke my colleague, Yarimar Bonilla, this is what it means to be a good Caribbeanist. I think Deb would probably agree, since we've always understood that there's no way to understand our contemporary world except as the sort of afterlives of slavery in the Caribbean plantation complex. So I think that in many respects, the models that we have to adopt have to be drawn capaciously from Black and Indigenous studies. And again, I think I'm also far from the first to call for this kind of intervention in anthropology. But I think the bigger question for me is, how do we make this approach that many of us are already engaged in hegemonic, rather than simply a minor tendency that exists at the fringes of our discipline? And I think that it's really helpful for me to continue to inhabit the passive voice of letting anthropology burn rather than burning down anthropology. I think it's more of a refusal to rehabilitate anthropology in these moments of crisis, but rather to sort of step into or indulge the sort of opportunity that the crisis presents. And I guess I'll stop here. I can pick up on this a bit later in subsequent questions, but I think we should really be sit with and confront maybe how this sort of unsettles our own desires for anthropology. Many of us, our livelihoods are staked to anthropology. So what does it mean to really see that entirely? So I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ryan. You're not off the hook yet, but we'll open it up to others to take up the first part of your response. And really the question then for them is, should anthropology burn, or do we let it burn, or should we rebuild under another banner? And maybe we'll turn to Lucia first and work from there. Lucia, do you want to take up that question?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank Deb, Kamari, and Danilyn, and those that sponsored this wonderful event. I'm really happy to be here with wonderful interlocutors. So thanks to all that are here and those that are watching. This is obviously an enduring conversation and quite ripe in these burning moments. Some of us are here or reporting to you from California, where we did see bloodied skies. So there are so many signs to heed. I think now is the time. I wanted to think a bit about Ryan's intervention and the ways that he exposes these gaps in various fixes in anthropologies, as he calls them, and how anthropology is responsible for almost always kind of circumscribing what it is to be or what it means to be human. And I think only from there can we really imagine what an anthropology of liberation might look like. He echoed the sentiments I excavated some years ago before in a review that I called In Dark Times, which I think asks us to bypass this kind of also enduring toxic positivity and moral optimism that always accompanies the suffering subject. And it's toxic for a reason. I think we need to think about why that might be, in part because it's almost always some kind of savage thought, right? So that review, though it was sheepish compared to Ryan's call to action, also implored us to consider the politics and power as it always relates to materiality. It was as if we could not let anthropology get off the hook. We have to think about the material conditions of life, and there's no way around it, I think. And more than ever, we can no longer afford to just do things any other way, lest we continue to bolster a discipline that commodifies subjectivity, essentially, in well-heeled, exquisitely imperial ways. That said, if anthropology is to burn and grow anew, I urge us to consider, at least in my discussion, three main and central thrusts from which to draw antidotes. I want us to think about the market as a universal agent par excellence. I want us to think about labor as it relates to field work. And hopefully in part two, I'll try to explore how there's an insistent racial politics of transnational surveillance. I really want to think about some of the calls made in the commentary about the transnational important nature of what Black internationalist movements have done, what we need to continue to do, not just in North America. I think many would agree. So that's kind of what my research tried to do specifically as I thought about advertising and branding. And I know we'll return to some of this later, but I was very interested in how culture and markets as conjunctures almost always reify race. And so one of the driving reasons for this interest is that consumer culture is kind of the object of, as an object of inquiry, is always a kind of culture that's universal. And I was indeed thinking of Michel Rouf-Trouillot and his understanding of culture, because it claims a kind of universality. So for me to think about race in relation to a process that almost everyone can partake in, I thought was important. Because often in anthropology, it's always alterity that seems to be at the fore of how we construct our subject. So I thought if we're going to excavate, then we need to think about processes that we're all complicit in. And I think consumer culture is one that we're all kind of guilty of indulging in. So I started there in some ways. And it was intentional because I think it helped and can help us think about those Michel Rouf-Trouillot's North Atlantic universals. Right. And I think if some way we can take to task what those universals are and understand how they play out unevenly and you know, maybe not construct a very rigid program, but always return to these things that are pernicious and universalizing and that always have the sort of liberal subject as a sort of emancipatory subject, if you will, that could be a beginning or a start because it also helps ethnographers, at least in my case, the choice of consumer culture was intentional because I sought in so many ways to resist the sort of classic ethnographic approach that brackets a particular, often marginal or abject culture. So it was a way of working through that also revealed how humans become differentiated and uneven in these processes. In my case, I looked at consumer culture to expose the sort of violence of representation in the liberal market, which always eclipses difference and shows how this conflation exploits Black and brown bodies in particular ways. Of course, I do this work in the context of Brazil, which always has mestizaje as the grand erasure of difference, right? And I wanted to also recount a moment that I had for those of us that were lucky enough to have Michel Rouf-Trouillot as a student. those that were his students will remember that he often cited his days as a taxi driver as some of the most ethnographically rich sources of theorizing. I think that's really important because I think it's a sort of loud whisper of sorts, but also a lesson to all anthropology to rebuild their labor and approach to fellow humans. It also forces us to remember, in his case, that a Black man laboring provides more comfort than the classic ethnographic gaze. And I think that was his point in some ways. So if we're to think about new ways to take on participant observation, we may want to follow Savannah, who's here with us, insists in her text that we also need to reconceive relationality to our interlocutors in crucial and critical ways. The ways that we labor alongside our interlocutors is super, I think, really, really important. This also means, I think, for us that we need to respond to what Bruno Latour called the factish of the site and the branding of fieldwork, right? I'm a Brazilianist as a brand, but I try to talk about other things I think are important that the market does, like Goya food products. But I find myself always having to sort of represent Brazil as this sort of deep knowledge of inquiry in the most fetishistic of ways. So how can we rethink the role of the nation state in circumscribing ethnographic production? How can we push against those categories that are so, so enduring, especially, this is an event sponsored by Wenner-Gren, how one gets fieldwork knowledge, how we get funding. Those kinds of things become really important. If you can't index a culture or a group, people will say the project is not feasible. So those things really kind of play out in critical ways that I think stand to be rethought. Let's see. For me, it was important not just to think about the market alongside vectors, but also if our call for radical humanism is to be realized, how anthropologists concerned with forms of exchange. And so I'm calling on economic anthropologists here in some ways to think about race and to think about undoing the market, right? This is Polanyi's dream. How can we begin to disembed this thing that has become so universal? This thing that quietly does brutal work alongside the state. I think many of us are invested in excavating statecraft and what the state produces. And I thought a lot about that in the context of Brazil, but it always is eclipsed by the market. So if we can disembed the ubiquity of these universalizing practices, especially of the purported free market, I think that's a beginning step. I think there's more to say in part 2 that I'll think about in terms of direct action and data, and I'll return to that. But I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Lucia. Let's turn to Savannah now, and then we'll go in order. So then I have Chris and Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Kamari. And I wanted to echo the thanks to you and Deb, and of course, Danilyn and Wenner-Gren for gathering us together, and UCLA Anthro also for co-sponsoring. I also want to confess that my response today is very much embedded in my experience of today, which many of us have seen. Not just the, for many, expected lack of response from the judicial system in the murder of Breonna Taylor, but it also comes after the maybe also expected preempting of certain kinds of public political response to that kind of violence. And so I'll talk a bit about that too, but I just wanted to say that that's kind of my framing experience of today. Kamari, when you offered us this question, I thought the way you posed it was really powerful, in which you said, you know, Ryan has offered us this provocation to let anthropology burn. Is that a reasonable course of action? And that really stuck with me, this concept of, is this reasonable or not? In part because reasonableness actually comes up in my ethnographic work. In the book, there's a certain set of exchanges between a school leader and a young Black woman, in which the principal says, but this other person is being reasonable and you're not, right? And of course, the person he's speaking about is a young man who has called her out her name, who has disrespected her, right? Who has physically assaulted someone else, but because he waited his turn to speak in that moment, raised his hand and pretended to respect the white authority in front of him, his non-Black person of color mode of engaging the state was seen as reasonable, right? And I think this question about what is reasonable and what is not is actually really key for us to understand what is an ethical course of action. Because of course it's not reasonable to let anthropology burn. I mean, most of us are, some of us are still paying rent. Some of us are paying for house notes on stolen land with the anthropology paychecks that we get in our paycheck, in our bank accounts. So I think if we were to let anthropology burn, for many of us, this is a very material question. And I think if reason is what gets us to where we are right now, really need to think about what is it that we're willing to risk, right? What is it that we're willing to hold in an open hand in this moment? And you may hear some sounds of first grade in the background because here we are in coronavirus. And so today's verdict in Louisville, right? So if you haven't heard about it, there were 3 officers that came to the home of Breonna Taylor, supposedly in search of her ex-boyfriend who was already in custody, and shot and killed her in her bed, in her pajamas. Today, none of them were held responsible for her death by the criminal justice system. Instead, Brett Hankerson, who did not shoot the gun who killed her, was charged for wanton endangerment, not of her, not of her partner, but because in killing her, he endangered her neighbors, which is such a terrible thing to do. And so Breonna Taylor's murder becomes written in as the reasonable course of action, right? And this low-level kind of low-level criminal charge of wanton endangerment inscribes her murder as the reasonable thing, and an accidental shot through the neighbor's house as the problem, right? So by displacing the problem from the dead Black woman's body into this accidental, into this other person's home, right? You're literally removing the site of injury. And so for me, I think it's important to understand that kind of creation of collateral damage, right? And so we're seeing very much like Ayanna Stanley Peterson's death, sleeping on the couch of her grandmother's house in Detroit, and another no-knock warrant, right? These bodies of Black women and girls are not necessarily spectacular targets of the state, right? They don't necessarily engender a hands up, don't shoot moment because they don't have a chance to put their hands up. They don't necessarily have a chance to look straight ahead to engage the state as someone who's targeted as a spectacular form of hyper-masculinized violence. Instead, they're literally written out of that kind of overtly political engagement. And then they become a reasonable and regrettable excuse in what the Kentucky Attorney General Dan Cameron sees as a justifiable war on the Black residents of Louisville. And so I think for me, it's important that as the boards go up around Target in Louisville, as all of the public, all the city and state institutions in Louisville have been closed and boarded up, that we don't allow the burning that Ryan is talking about to only be a referent to the wildfires, the ash of which is still on my car here in Oakland, California. But we don't allow ourselves to bracket out the burning that was rehearsed over and over and over again on our television screens from Kenosha to right here in Oakland, California. And that those kinds of fires, which not only are being, they have a political impact, right? Because the fires are being used over and over by various kind of political operatives, right? To engender some investment in a white right wing, but we can bracket that. I think what's important is that there's a certain refusal of the previous reasonable assumption of what politics looks like, right? So if the burning of police cars and Targets and CVS's and property destruction has become part of a national political toolkit, rather than one's affective relationship to that toolkit, I think it's important for us to account for that the kind of state fix that Ryan is writing against, right? Ryan says we have to move against the state fix. We are behind the curve. Rayshard Brooks was shot sleeping in his car as an unhoused man in Atlanta before the sun came up. The Wendy's he was in front of was on fire. People are already moving against the state fix. And if we're not theorizing and moving with them, we will not only not have the capacity to comprehend what's happening, we certainly will have missed the opportunity to have any input or shaping of what's happening. And so I think, Ryan, I really wanted to appreciate this, not just thinking against the state fix, but seeing the state fix, the technological fix, the anthropological fix, if you will, and the decolonial fix as conjoined, right? And not to say that those are not, they're not areas of action available, but really thinking against the fixingness, right? And, you know, I'm saying this from my own campus at UC Santa Cruz, where I still have undergraduate students who are facing criminal charges for their efforts to support graduate students in getting a cost of living allowance increase. So the COLA movement on our campus was responded to with police force. Sometimes we think, oh, economic problems, homelessness over here, right? Policing and abolition over there, but they're really conjoined, whether it's Rayshard Brooks being homeless and sleeping outside of Wendy's, right? And then being killed by the police. To my own campus at UC Santa Cruz, where 14% of graduate students and 7% of undergraduates meet the technical definition of homelessness. Hi, honey. Hi, honey. And so if you're in a context, yes, you do. If you're in a context where 14% of graduate students are unhoused, right? And the ethical move by the university is to arrest the undergraduate, right? Who had bruises on him after he was arrested. If that's the response, I think it's important for us to not just for us to hook together our understanding of these different kinds of fixes. And finally, honey, can you go another one? Thank you, baby. Finally, in terms of this, sorry, y'all. If we understand that fixing anthropology is the reasonable thing to do, if we're moving towards the unreasonable, we have such a strong tradition, right? Trio, obviously, thinking about the unthinkable and the unreasonable. What gets rendered as a non-event, right? The Haitian Revolution, the murder of Breonna Taylor, these narratives that wrap in these huge, not consequential, intimately consequential politically events into a narrative of this didn't happen, right? And that to me is the gift that you've given us, Ryan, in not going for the fix, right? Because the fix is that which covers over the event, it covers over the break. And I think as opposed to going for all these different fixes or finding better fixes, if we attend to the brokenness, right, and allow the brokenness to be the entry point, that will give us an opportunity to at least ethically encounter and do what Deborah has so sharply offered us, as bearing witness to that violence as point zero, the first thing that has to happen before any kind of moving forward. And I think it's important that as opposed to fixing, a $2,500 stipend for graduate students here, right? Or some body cams there, that we really attend to our affective investments in not seeing the break. So thank you again, Ryan, for that. It really is important provocation. It's given me a lot to be with at this time.
Great, thank you, Savannah. You've given us a lot to think about, both you and Lucia. Let's move to Chris now, and then we'll go to Jonathan. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, great. I also want to start by thanking the Wenner-Gren Foundation, UCLA Department of Anthropology, Deborah Thomas, Kamari Clarke, and Danilyn Rutherford for the invitation to be part of this conversation, to my interlocutors here, who I admire greatly, and also to the people that are listening via the YouTube live stream. So I think, many of the critiques and issues that we're identifying within anthropology and with the practice and methodologies that we work with as anthropologists are conversations that we've been having for quite a long time. And I think all of us here are aware of that. The calls to decolonize the discipline stem back decades and largely have been animated by anthropologists of color who have been really centrally concerned with the ways in which anthropological methods reproduce structures of power or operate within those hierarchies without necessarily problematizing or seeking to undo them. And so I want to start actually by sharing a very brief quote from one of my interlocutors in Honduras, where I do my research. I've worked on the Caribbean coast of Honduras with Garifuna communities since 2005. And I've worked very closely with the Garifuna organization, Ofrane, that's the Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras. And so I'll start by sharing this brief quote, and then I'll move into some more general comments. Quote, "Anthropology has ceased to be a branch of philosophy and ethnography and has become like a colonial science that since the 19th century has been used by the British as part of their schemes of domination. Today, anthropologists have achieved their niche within the armed forces of the United States through the project known as the Human Terrain System, highlighting more than ever the colonialist vision of anthropology. Now, this quote was written by Dixon Alvarez, activist with Ofrane, and in response to the recent arrival of several anthropologists, myself included, within Garifuna communities on the north coast of Honduras. And so our arrival generated quite a bit of debate and discussion of what our aims were as anthropologists. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because I think it's really important. Sometimes we think that these conversations or these questions that we have about anthropology, it's links to colonialism, it's links to kind of structures of power that we perhaps are all committed to undoing and questioning, that those debates are only happening amongst us, amongst other anthropologists, amongst critical anthropologists or progressive anthropologists or radical anthropologists. But in fact, those debates are happening and are thriving among our interlocutors in the field as well, in the field which we should problematize as Savannah and Ryan have encouraged us to do, right? But these conversations are happening on the ground where we work as well. And I think taking that as the starting point for me has been central to the way in which I've tried to kind of think through the question of how to do anthropological work, perhaps in a more ethical fashion. And so the central question that was asked of me was, is anthropology an extractivist endeavor? And if we take that as the central question, then where does that lead us to? What sort of, as Savannah mentioned just now, what sort of fixes are possible? Or do we even want to try and engage in fixes in the way that we have tried to in the past? Acknowledging, of course, that there have been many wonderful interventions and productive dialogues and debates already within the field around the issues that we're discussing here today. So in my own work, one of the things that was required of me to be able to do the work was that I engage in a dialogic, reflexive, and reciprocal process with my field interlocutors, with the Garifuna activists that I was engaged with, who were fighting against, confronting multiple crises, a crisis of dispossession of their lands within the communities, within Black communities along the coast of Honduras, fighting a crisis that was generated by an extractivist development regime, not just in mining and agribusiness, but also in tourism. So these modes of development that were leading to a real existential crisis for the people that I was working with, one that threatened their very existence and their ability to continue thriving and living in the future. And so these were the conditions that I encountered upon entering my field site, and which necessitated that I think about my role, not just as someone that was studying and collecting data to produce anthropological theory, but as my interlocutors demanded of me, someone that was going to be making tangible contributions to the struggles that they were engaged with. And so that required a complete and total reorientation. Luckily, I had the training of University of Texas at Austin, African Diaspora and Activist Anthropology program. My colleagues in that program have all made really wonderful contributions to these debates. My mentors at the University of Texas at Austin too. So I had some of these critical questions in mind when I began my anthropological work in Honduras, but it still required a fundamental reorientation and a deep internal questioning of what it was I was trying to accomplish and what the aims of the work I was doing were. And so one of the things that I was asked to do was to socializar, or to socialize my research. Now, socializar, this is something I've written about previously. I wrote actually in a current anthropology article in 2016. Socializar is not just to socialize. It's not just to share the research. So that in part is a return, right? A devolución, as they say in Honduras, to bring the research back, to share it with the people that you're in dialogue with the communities that your work engages. But the socializar, the devolución, the return is more than that. It's a return to engage in a dialogic process, to think in dialogue with our interlocutors about the actual nature of the work that's been done and the knowledge that is emerging from that work. To understand, for me, it was really fundamental to understand my interlocutors in the field as producers of the knowledge, as co-producers of that knowledge. And so I remember going back to the field upon completing a first very rough draft of my dissertation and sharing those findings, sharing that work with people in a community meeting in Triunfo de la Cruz, where I did my dissertation field research, and having a very rich, very rich and very kind of sharp debate about the findings of my work that were fundamental to my understanding and to some of the subsequent scholarship that I've produced within anthropology. So the devolución is about that type of return, but it's also a return to these foundational questions, the questions that Ryan is asking us, the questions of, what do we do with anthropology? Do we let anthropology burn? What are the fixes? I think that what Ryan offered in his article with regard to, the title of the article and the ecological perspective really is really provocative, because what it does is it asks us to think deeply and in a historical way about these debates, about these problems that we're identifying and engaging with in our work, and also in relation to one another, and trying to think through new ways of doing anthropology, or a rethink of what anthropology is in this moment. And so those are just some short comments that I'll share.
Great, thank you, Chris. We'll move on to Jonathan now.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to be in dialogue with you all. I'm grateful for the invitation to share with you and to be in conversation with this, serious audience we apparently have, although it's virtual, which makes it awkward. But let me just begin by saying, I think, echoing some comments that many of my colleagues have made in reference to what they're observing in relation to their everyday realities in the world right now and on the campuses where our anthropology departments are housed. I think Savannah's account of Breonna Taylor's murder and the response to it, the juridical response to it, points to some of the major issues that concern many of us in this conversation, which is that we don't get the sense that within our discipline, our knowledges reflect or are able to speak to a reality in which Breonna Taylor's murder, her disposability, is the starting point for law, from which law, sociality, infrastructure, everyday life are organized and regulated. That her disposability is what needs to happen, needs to exist in order for life to go on. And the concern is that our disciplines' pragmatic approaches to overcoming racism, to overcoming colonialism, to overcoming or addressing or challenging or unsettling various systems of power, they often rely on a relativist and a pragmatic kind of relativist logic. And I think part of what many of us are trying to push back against are the conceits of that sort of an approach, that sort of an attempt to overcome these systems. And part of the concern is that the anthropological response, the effort, for example, in the last 10 or 20 years to imagine a kind of post-human, a kind of post-humanism in relation to the so-called ontological turn, which for many of us who first encountered ontology, discussions of ontology through Fanon, through Black Skin, White Masks, articulated in 1956, the idea that the ontological turn was happening in 2010 was appalling. And we were wondering on whose backs, on whose histories, on whose dispossession, on whose death Is the ontological turn being advanced? Is the post-human being advanced? And we wanted to think really critically about for whom this is post. I mean, it's September 23rd today, right? So for whom is this a post moment? September 23rd is, for Puerto Ricans, when we commemorate Grito de Lares, which took place in 1868. Puerto Rico was free, was independent for 24 hours in 1868. About 24 hours over 520 years, or 30 years at this point. And so when we think about for whom this is a post moment, and also, from a Puerto Rican perspective, thinking about this as the third anniversary of Hurricane Maria, which Yarimar Bonilla calls a colonial disaster, that also underscores a kind of default disposability and default abandonment that we are wrapped up in, that we're connected to, and that many of us are experiencing acutely and observing acutely, and feel compelled to develop our analytics in response to. We feel as though we need to be able to understand how a world emerges out of this kind of abandonment. There's also just the kind of mundane abandonment that speaks to the killing of Breonna Taylor, the abandonment of various populations in relation to housing and education and employment and challenges that various populations are facing in relation to mental and physical wellness. These challenges are often taking place within blocks of anthropology departments, and the faculty who populate those departments, we perceive in many cases as ill-equipped to even begin to make sense of those realities that are in their immediate surroundings, much less distant realities. And I think the anthropological approach to these kinds of discussions has often been to say, we do better at analyzing things that are far away from us than we do things that are close to us. That's no longer a tenable explanation for this kind of ignorance and this kind of numbness. And in fact, our concern is that this numbness is cooked into the discipline, and that which we don't have to pay attention to, that which we're systematically primed not to notice, not to observe, are very particular populations' experiences. And this is why Chris's comments about theorizing with our interlocutors is often imaginable from any mainstream anthropological perspectives. We do this within, the ethnographic trick we pull is this. We say, oh, you've told us what your informants, collaborators, research participants, you've told us how they see their world. Now take several steps back and tell us, recontextualize this anthropologically. Tell us, which is, essentially to say, tell us what's really happening. You've told us what these people think is happening. Now tell us what's really going on, rather than imagining various population survivance as requiring a profound form of theorization, and world making and analytical capacity that our discipline needs to humble itself in response to. Various other disciplinary projects have engaged in, have taken up this kind of call for humility in a way that anthropologists could learn from and learn with. And I think that that's part of what many of us are trying to push toward. Now, let me say this, the question about, I appreciate Ryan's framing around a passive voice and an active, not just because I'm a linguistic anthropologist, and I want to make a comment at some point about needing a new grammar, because the problem is that the notion of grammar is tied to the very forms of humanism, universal humanism, that we need to undo here. This idea that grammar is what gives coherence to language, that's the problem. So I don't know about these invocations of grammar, it's a concern for me. But I think that part of this question around what we're going to do with this discipline and how we, where we go from here, we don't trust the discipline on its own terms to check itself, to provide accountability structures. I think I had the chance to teach Savannah's book this summer in a directed reading with a few students, and part of the power of the book, the structure of the book, and Savannah does not let readers off the hook. Every chapter introduces you to what looks like a victory, an educational victory, a progressive victory, an opportunity to move forward in a positive new direction. And Savannah shows you how those victories systematically take place on the backs of, at the expense of Black students and Black communities in the San Francisco Bay Area in the context of her research. And I guess this is part of what we're continually thinking about. To what extent is this discipline equipped to provide accountability to itself? And what alternative sorts of accountability measures could we implement or construct collectively, not just interdisciplinarily with our colleagues in other fields, but also, with very different kinds of community commitments. And that perhaps brings me to my last point, which would be to say, for the purposes of provocating and framing a dialogue like this, it's perhaps useful to frame anthropology as a thing, a singular thing. But of course, there are many anthropologies. Of course, not just in terms of our subfields, but let me tell you something. When I gave my first job in the Department of Anthropology at UMass Amherst, and the first question after my job talk was, what role did your research participants play in designing the questions that informed your work? And I said, what did you just ask me? I was coming from, a training that privileged a very particular approach to framing one's questions and to thinking about what legitimate research is, what theoretical innovation looks like, what progress looks like for our discipline. And I encountered a totally different vision of what anthropology is from a four-field perspective, which was also novel to me in so many ways. And so I want to think about many anthropologies, not just within our departments, but within the communities that we're working with, where again, people are, I think Yadi Marbonilla writes about this in the preface to Non-Sovereign Futures, where she thinks, again, with Trouillot, since we're gonna continue to shout out Trouillot in this conversation, what it would look like to co-theorize with one's collaborators, as Chris mentioned as well. What is involved in that work? What are the limitations of that work as well? Because it's also, we want to be careful about just romanticizing particular forms of collaboration, because precisely through modes of participation or roping people into particular modes of participation that we might inadvertently reproduce some of the very challenges that we're trying to rethink. So those are just some of my opening comments. And I guess the way that I've tried to overcome this in my work is by rethinking a lot of our starting points. I don't think anthropological empiricism is equipped to tell us much about many of the realities that people are facing right now, which suggests that the kind of pragmatic approach to observation needs to take into account, needs to humble itself in the face of some existential challenges that perhaps we're not well equipped to observe through a traditional, conventional ethnographic encounter. Maybe we need modes of perception, of observation, other ways of thinking about observation in order to make sense of what these worlds are and could be.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. And clearly questions of humility are part of this conversation. So thank you for teasing that out. Before turning the next set of questions over to Deb, I wanted to return us to Brian, because we would be remiss to not think about the older guard, or those who might be sitting at home listening and saying that in fact they feel completely erased by the call for abandoning anthropology's liberal suppositions, that in fact their work they feel has been critical, that it's helped the constituencies, that it's empathetic, that it's politically meaningful. We've heard these statements and these defenses which are heartfelt, and many of these very people might insist that it seems unfair, part of cancel culture, that we can't see nuance in this question and this approach. And so I wonder, Ryan, if you can return us to that. It's some of it is generational, some of it isn't, and it speaks to the very liberalism that you're describing. And maybe if you could, before we transition to the next set of questions, if you can return to that, or speak to that critique that this seems like cancel culture, that what about the good work and the good fight that those before us have done?
Thank you for that, Kamari. I guess I thought about a number of ways of answering this question. I think I'll be as frank as possible, but I think also start with sort of Jonathan's point that not only are there multiple anthropologies, but the so-called old guard within our discipline is also not a monolith. So I want to think about sort of which old guard and sort of whose elders we're upholding in this conversation. And I guess I'll start by pointing out that my critique is that I make in the article is of the Boasian fix and not of Boas himself. And I think that's been conflated in a number of circles. And I guess as a cheap authenticating gesture, I'll point out that my own training is just 3 degrees removed from Boas himself. So one of my undergrad mentors, Peggy Sanday, was a student of Margaret Mead's as an undergraduate at Columbia. And I just wanted to point out that the Boas that I came to know quite well through Peggy is quite different than the version that we see rehearsed by the sort of liberal anti-racist thrust that seems to be circulating since the publication of my article. And maybe my reading is too generous via Peggy of Boas in awarding a kind of undue radicalism to his work. But I'm thinking about Peggy's model of what she calls public interest anthropology in relation to its sort of cousins like engaged anthropology or activist anthropology in both the UT Austin school that I actually think finds a very strong precedent in Boas's later years. And Peggy used to often cite this 1941 wartime radio address that Boas makes, where he says that, we can no longer, and I'm paraphrasing, we can't allow the pursuit of truth to be the privilege or province of a scientist alone, but we need to democratize this inquiry to understand the problems that confront us all. And Peggy sees this as a fundamental break in sort of Boas's approach to the discipline of anthropology. And this is, in many respects, the version that brought me to study anthropology as well. So I think that when we look at Boas's actual words, rather than a kind of crude reduction of them, I question why my own assertion invites so much pushback. And I make this point in the essay itself, that for Boas, his own prior liberal suppositions weren't sufficient to confront colonialism or Nazism in 1941. I certainly don't think that they suffice now either. And I think no anthropologist who, as a part of this old guard has been committed to a horizon of radical humanism would feel implicated by the critique I'm making. In fact, I was really surprised that the literature that was published in 2019 even brought me to articulate this critique of relativism for what seems like the upteenth time. So I think I was surprised to see so much pushback on this point, because I thought I was sort of rehearsing something that was quite passé at the point that I was engaging with it. I just want to also address this cancel culture point, because I think that if we're really considering who's been guilty of cancel culture in anthropology, we have to think about who was excluded by this same old guard. So I mean, what is Zora Neale Hurston's story other than when being canceled by anthropology? So many, it wasn't just Zora Neale Hurston, many of the sort of contemporaries of this old guard that we're invoking were canceled in order to maintain anthropology as we know it. And I think this is true for countless scholars of color, Black and Indigenous women scholars in particular. And this is not a distant history in our field. I think we all personally know colleagues who were bullied and harassed out of the discipline under the very guises of sort of relativism and liberal anti-racism, whether it's the fact that they didn't receive tenure and left the academy, or left their graduate programs, or didn't pursue anthropology in the first place. So I think my sort of aim here is really in doing justice to their work and their legacy, and to start kind of elevating the kinds of interventions that have been canceled in service of anthropology over the past several decades.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I want to pick up on something that many of you have spoken about in different kinds of ways, and that points to what Ryan raises in that essay about the ways a renewed anthropology demands that anthropologists eschew the kind of exceptionalism that places itself outside of the histories of violence, and instead, as Ryan was just saying, reckon with its own history, reckon with the ways that anthropologists and anthropology as a discipline also participated in these forms of exclusion. And if we're, thinking back to the moment of conquest, of indigenous dispossession, of quote unquote discovery, of Atlantic slavery, to the marking of particular subjects as human, and therefore as endowed with the ability to be rational. I think it also takes us back to Savannah's earlier provocation to think about what kinds of possibilities lie in the unreasonable. You know, what would it mean for anthropology to actually wrestle with and reckon with not only affective investments, Savannah was talking about the affective investments in not seeing the break, but also the material investments of not seeing the break. And I think when I'm thinking about these issues, I always am drawn to the work of people theorizing refusal, which is a way to theorize exclusion. And, you know, coming out of two bodies of scholarship, right? Transnational Black feminist thought, thinking about refusal in the language of Tina Campt, for example, and then also Indigenous anthropologists thinking about refusal of Indigenous persons in both senses, refusal to accept and accommodate the dominant narratives, the dominant state structures, the dominant forms of recognition, dominant forms of subjectivity, right? Which are reproduced by anthropology, by the method, by an older method, which continues to presume a kind of coherent subject that can be known, that can be documented, that can be spoken for. So I wanted to ask Ryan to talk a little bit more about what it would mean to be more attuned to this history. You know, I think people are speaking a bit about the ways anthropologists recognize inequalities, recognize discrimination, recognize violence in a field somewhere, but don't use those same tools, don't necessarily use those same tools to come to terms with and comprehend what's going on in their departments, in their universities, in their cities, in their nation states. So what would that mean for you, Ryan, in this period?
Sure, I might actually answer this question by telling a very quick story from the 2018 AAAs that I didn't include in my essay. So I remember that when I got to San Jose, I called a rideshare from the airport. There's smoke everywhere. The experience of encountering the smoke is really palpable. I remember in this, having a conversation with this rideshare driver where I was asking about sort of how the smoke had been, and he said that it was a lot better than the previous week and he didn't mind it too much. And of course, we started talking about Trump's statements on Twitter that week about sort of blaming the wildfires on sort of California bureaucrats and mismanagement of the forests. And I just remember this moment where I brought up and I started engaging conversation around the use of carceral labor to fight the wildfires. And he sort of dismissed me and said, like, you know, that he felt so lucky to live in a blue state like California. He didn't have to worry about conservatives like Trump and in his daily life. And I found it so odd, even if unsurprising, how easily this could be reconciled with the smoke and fires around us, as well as California's own authoritarianism as a principal theater of mass incarceration. So I say all this by way of sort of addressing anthropology's exceptionalism to point out the different spaces and geographies that become coded as exceptions to the crises that we're contending with today, whether that's the sort of liberal state of California or the discipline of anthropology. I think this is where the comparison to Malibu comes in. I think both American exceptionalism and the exceptionalism of American anthropology go hand in hand in this way. So the very notion that the US anthropology exists separate from its various fields and objects of study is a myth that seems to pervade both this kind of Boasian gambit that I was talking about, as well as professional spaces like the AAAs themselves. And I actually just wanted to reflect quickly on a piece that two of my grad school colleagues, Samar Al-Balushi and Shahana Ghosh, along with their co-author, Madiha Taher, penned for the AA forum that was published yesterday. And they open it by saying sort of, what would it mean if the 2018 AAAs had been in Djibouti City rather than in San Jose, and amidst a different set of fires altogether? And I think if this sounds absurd to an audience of American or US-based anthropologists, I think that's precisely their point. And it's this exceptionalism that sustains the enterprise of US anthropology. And I guess by way of answering their hypothetical, I think if the AAAs had been in Djibouti City amidst the sort of US military incursion on Yemen, my observations wouldn't change at all. But I think that the conceits of anthropology's liberal humanism would have been a lot clearer to many audiences. And I kind of want to unpack why that would be the case. So I want to challenge the idea that the fires of California and Yemen don't have a common origin or foundation. I really found it productive in my own reflection on the AAAs to step into those contradictions by refusing to indulge the exceptionalism of San Jose that my rideshare driver was invoking as being outside the orbit of violence that pervades, militarized choke points in the Horn of Africa, for instance. So in a more straightforward way, I guess, I'm asking why we can clearly see US empire in the military occupation of Djibouti and not in the centuries-long settler occupation of California. So, rather than enforcing a kind of area studies model or indulging the limiting frame of comparison that I think we're often instructed to as anthropologists, we really need to regard these geographies, these violences, these fires as historically and genealogically linked. As a scholar of the Caribbean, as a person of Caribbean and Black American descent, I consider this to be my entire intellectual and political project, to provincialize the US in this very same way by centering a critique of liberal humanism in the histories of Atlantic slavery and the Caribbean plantation complex. And maybe I can follow my grad school colleagues a bit here by sort of exploding what I think is an equally limited frame of the Atlantic world. That not only are these discourses of race and the human forged on New World plantations, but I think we can only understand the Atlantic world as a sort of hermetic geography with an eye toward, for instance, the Mediterranean, especially the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, to the Indian Ocean. We think about sort of the sites of slave raids in Madagascar and Mozambique, in the Cape. It might be obvious I've been reading a lot of Gerald Horne's recent work during quarantine. But I guess, to bring it back to what this means for anthropology today, I think that if we're going to push forward toward an ideal of abolition globally, which it must be if it's going to genuinely be abolition, it can't rely on a liberal order that we project as a foil to these sites of authoritarian disorder that we often sort of see in anthropological writing. I think this is what my colleague William Mazzarella calls anthropology's liberal settlement. We can't afford to treat San Jose as the liberal foil to, sort of US occupied Djibouti when they're constituted by the very same order of things that has its foundation in, again, sort of the plantation complex. And I guess just I'll end by saying that, I think a lot of folks are desperate for a return to so-called, normalcy. That would preserve this fictive division between these geographies. I guess rather than a kind of flat, reflexive, turning the ethnographic eye back on ourselves and the US state, I think we really need to complicate what ourselves as a category is. I mean, it's always implicitly racialized and gendered, alongside offering a kind of fictive coherence to the ethnographic subjects that we place under scrutiny. So I think, in a way, it's the inverse or the opposite of the relativist impulse, because it doesn't try to take a context on its own terms, but it rather it situates all of these geographies, whether it's San Jose or Djibouti or Kingston or Port of Spain or Berlin or Tokyo, in relation to these constitutive histories of violence that award a false coherence to the project of liberal universalism. I'm also thinking about my colleague Darrell Lee's work on sort of universalism, and particularly on jihad as a practice or discourse of universalism as well. So I don't think I have time to sort of meditate on the specific revisions to theory and method that this would require. Maybe I'll pick that up in the Q&A. But I think this is a really important moment to do so, especially when traditional field work and graduate training, we're not taking any of these things for granted because of the crises in front of us.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think it does really require a revision of a theory of the subject. And I think that's the hardest thing sometimes to get undergraduate students to do who are raised in the United States, right? To think outside of this liberal, progressive narrative of perfectibility, and to instead understand that the foundation of this liberal empire is really slavery and indigenous dispossession, and that requires a different way of thinking about the subject. Lucia, I want to turn to you and to also hear the ideas that you have in terms of the limitations of this coherent human subject methodologically. And I also would like you to spend a little bit of time thinking about the current moment, right? The current moment post this summer is the impetus for institutions to now be called to account, right? And the ways that the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives, really coalesced this summer seems to have finally prompted some movement, and many institutions are pledging commitments to addressing systemic racism. You know, obviously important and laudable, and sometimes too little too late, or to some it may feel like too little too late. So I want you to also tell us a little bit about what your approach is, what your understanding is of students who are demanding these kinds of changes from university leadership. Is there a way to improve the current dispensation? Or how do we think about anthropology as a kind of suspicious discipline in this respect, in terms of the ways that it has continually erased indigenous knowledges and ontologies? Can you talk a little bit about that? You're muted. You have to take off.
Thank you for that question. It's a mouthful, so I'm going to try to kind of catch it at different angles. We could begin to do simple things like the University of Chicago English department, right? Simply deciding that you need to move a little bit beyond just assuming that diversity exists, but, you know, targeting specific projects. That's a clear example of what the academy can begin to do to move beyond just a kind of more bland politics of representation. But obviously that's not enough, right? These solidarity statements are not enough. Even just talking about these things are not enough. They have to sort of truly index structural shifts. And of course that goes without saying. So I kind of wanted to return a bit to Chris's point about anthropology being a kind of an extractivist endeavor. I thought that was really sort of poignant and reminded me of what I was saying about the notion of culture. And in some ways I'm echoing Mazzarella as well, when he said that culture is this structurally ambivalent thing, right? That we can, as anthropologists, take apart, but the market kind of does other magical things with it, right? So we're done looking at culture as a noun, and we're looking at it as a verb, and the rest of the world takes it as a noun and does things to it. So I think, again, I'm always kind of drawing from this analytic of what the market does, and the free market, so to speak. I thought it was interesting that we mentioned that the discipline doesn't, you know, it self-regulates. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Markets self-regulate. And we know that that's a fiction, right? So that's something we clearly need to really deeply think about. I also wanted to think precisely, just like Ryan mentioned, the article that Al-Balushi, Ghosh, and Tahir offer us in the commentary, take really seriously what this American exceptionalism is about, and how it's locatable. And also, more importantly, that there are regimes of surveillance that have emerged, transnational regimes of surveillance that have emerged alongside the production of this knowledge. This is not at all new for our discipline. And I think now is a really important time to rethink what the human area research files could look like if we were to innovate that old, or I don't know how many of us actually go to that to think about how knowledge is bracketed, but that's a space, right? Because now more than ever, data has become a commodity more valuable than oil, right? So we're going to think about ways in which anthropologists can think about sites for intervention. I think data is a huge, huge space. I know that Kamari's and others have begun to think about that, but the politics of data is super critical in this moment. I've begun to think about it in the context of biometric capitalism in Brazil, where the transnational and imperial vectors have become more and more obvious, especially with the shifts in leadership and the judicialization of governance there, which has allowed, obviously, international governance regimes to do away with I want to say power to the people, but it's so much more complicated. But what we're witnessing is the FBI, for example, enter Brazil and start to catalog biometric information. What does that sound like? Sounds like transnational surveillance. So we really need to, I think, start intervening in data surveillance regimes if we're going to do the work of shaping how humans are managed. I can think of algorithms that take students, at-risk students, and already sort of are predictors for policing and things like that. So I think we really need to intervene in algorithms in ways that we used to think we were doing benign work or good work. We still need to be good enough anthropologists, and I think target these zones in novel and important ways, because they're sort of slipping through our fingers as we're thinking about field sites in really static ways. I think we need to think about the things that are always kind of hovering. And I think data is an important space to think about. I think I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lucia. Chris, you talked earlier about co-creating ethical guidelines with interlocutors and as your work centers political alliances. I wonder if you could say more about how you might scale that out across the discipline. What are the practices that you have been developing that you think are transformative practices and perhaps radical humanist practices for the discipline as a whole? And what are the limitations of those kinds of practices? Sorry, you're also muted.
Thank you for that question, Deborah. And I also want to apologize for my poor lighting here. My friends know that I'm not very technologically savvy, and my Zoom setup here is a little bit impoverished. But I would like to start with some of the limitations, actually. So if we're thinking about, how anthropology participates in exclusion, so that was one of the questions that you asked earlier, Deborah. And then also thinking about how we might go about doing anthropology differently. And so again, just to kind of return to the experience that I had, because I was so explicitly confronted with these questions about the extractivist nature of anthropological research and data collection. And because I was accused of being, in fact, a knowledge cannibal. Un antropófago was the language that was used. And I had to think very deeply about these questions upon entering the field. And so I think part of the, part of the conversation that we're having around, what the field is even, and whether or not we can think of the field as this thing over there, as opposed to a field of kind of, a field that we're all kind of inhabiting together. I think that also raises some really provocative and important questions for us here. But, in my own approach, one of the things that I tried to do was to work with some of the research methodologies that I was exposed to when I was being trained at the University of Texas, and then also innovate those. So and I'm not saying this in a way that's intended to be programmatic. I want to be really clear about this. I want to acknowledge Jonathan and others' comments that there are multiple anthropologies and multiple ways of doing research. And so this is what I ended up employing. These are the kind of tools I ended up employing when I was doing my research in Honduras. But again, employing some of the tools of kind of activist anthropology, thinking in dialogue with the people I was working with at Ofrane, with the Garifuna land activists that I was engaged with, thinking about the questions of the research, the orientation of the research, the location of the research, the methodologies of the research through this dialogic process. So that for me was one really fundamental way of doing it, doing what I consider to be and still consider to be now politically engaged anthropology. And there are many, many anthropologists that have written and thought about this, Stuart Kirsch, Charlie Hale, et cetera, et cetera. But I also want to think about that. I want to kind of problematize it a bit, because I'm thinking about Ryan's comments about the liberal fix, or what you just referred to as a liberal foil. And I want to think about how sometimes the activist or the politically engaged anthropology occupies that position of the kind of liberal foil to these more colonial modes of doing research and collecting data, to the more extractivist modes, right? And so if we're to problematize the liberal foil, then we also must call into question the activist and politically engaged orientation that I myself took up when I approached my field research. And so one way in which that became really, really kind of sharply illustrated was actually after I concluded my dissertation research, and as I was entering the faculty at the University of San Francisco, I was asked by Ofrane to work as an expert witness, to serve as an expert witness for the case of the Garifuna community, Triunfo de la Cruz versus the state of Honduras, which went to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And when I first received that invitation, I was deeply troubled because I have my own critiques of the law, the institutional space of the court as a space wherein I could achieve the sort of radical change, or perhaps do the type of solidarity work that I was interested in doing. And I felt like I would be greatly constrained within that space. And that became really clearly illustrated when I was proposed. I ended up agreeing to do the work. And when the Honduran prosecutor representing the state government said, no, you can't do this work because you're an activist. Because you're an activist anthropologist, you're biased, and therefore you can't provide a sort of objective, unbiased account of what's happened and taking place in Triunfo de la Cruz, and you would be necessarily predisposed to thinking in a biased fashion about the state's complicity in the forms of dispossession, racialized dispossession that were taking place and that are ongoing within Triunfo de la Cruz. So in that instance, my status as a researcher that was engaging in a politically engaged methodological approach led to me being questioned, or to a questioning of the viability of my status as an expert. So it undermined my expert knowledge and capacity to produce expertise in the context of the courtroom. Ultimately, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights agreed to let me do this work, and I did produce an expert witness report. And the case of Triunfo de la Cruz, the judgment from the Inter-American Court was issued in October of 2015, and in that judgment, the state was indeed found to be complicit in the violation of Garifuna territorial rights. Now, again, here comes another question about the liberal foil, because the law, like anthropology, can serve as this liberal foil, right? And we can see the limitations of that because, for instance, the judgment has not produced in any concrete material changes on the ground with regard to Garifuna land tenure and their communities. It's an extremely, extraordinarily important win on the part of the community against the state. It sets a precedent within international law. And at the same time, there are significant limitations in terms of what types of justice can be realized vis-a-vis that forum. And that makes me think of the work that Savannah is doing, of course, in progressive dystopia, right? And when we, when a win, what appears as a win doesn't necessarily produce the sort of material changes that we are attempting to achieve, right? And so, and in fact, this situation has become even more violent. In July, so just less than 2 months ago, several Garifuna men from Triunfo de la Cruz, activists aligned with the Garifuna organization Ofrane, were violently kidnapped from their community and remain disappeared. They haven't been found. The Honduran state has been mostly mum. There's been a really kind of troubling silence around their disappearance, a lack of investigation of who might be responsible. So I just wanted to share these bits with you. And I know that we're running out of time, so I'll conclude my comments there. Thanks.
I'm sorry to have to speed us up. I feel like we're just getting started in some ways with the more concrete iterations of what are the kinds of things we can do to really transform the dominant methodologies, the dominant categories of anthropological research. Before we turn briefly to Jonathan and Savannah, I do want to bring Zoe back into this grid, I guess I was going to say the room, because she did send, I think, some really thoughtful comments after reflecting on her own experience within an anthropology department at Carleton in Canada and seeking a transfer to sociology. And when she was thinking about what needs to happen, she wrote to us that she's been drawing from Tiffany Lethabo King's articulations of edgelessness, of the edgeless realities between slavery and genocide. And this is part of a broader project that I think is so important and so necessary that seems to be taking off in a different way right now, which is to really think indigenous dispossession and imperialism and slavery in relation, right? And find points of convergence while also maintaining an understanding of the specificity of these experiences. So she wrote, and I'll read it just briefly. She copied a section of the preface from the Black Shoals, which reads, "To share the hemisphere with indigenous people also experiencing the day-to-day terror of conquest molds the form of your own experience with conquest as slavery. What my unnamed ancestors knew of slavery was life and world altering. They knew of a terror that exceeded the memory and understanding of what we think we now know of slavery. I do not believe that genocide and slavery can be contained. Neither has edges, yet each is distinct. Each form of violence has its own way of contaminating, haunting, touching, caressing, and whispering to the other." That's the end of the quote. So Zoe Todd writes, "This edgelessness informs my teaching in Indigenous studies and sociology on Indigenous environmental issues, and she encourages her students to consider how histories of enslavement and histories of genocide shape the present material realities of life in Canada. So she writes, in this sense, First Nations, Inuit, Métis people in Canada have responsibilities to this edgelessness, to consider the struggle of African diasporic peoples in this hemisphere as central to overthrowing settler, or as King writes, conquistador humanist systems and structures, including white anthropology," right? So there she's really drawing us to that relation. She's drawing us to thinking across boundaries in the ways that we reimagine what it means to be human, who has inhabited the definition of humanness, and really encouraging students to think through that relation as well. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. I want to return just briefly to Savannah and Jonathan, and also pick up at least one question from the chat. So let me turn it over. Savannah, can you, sorry, give us a sense of what the possibilities are. Ryan clearly drew on your work when writing the review essay and thinking about your call for an abolitionist anthropology. And it would be wonderful if you would speak more about what that looks like for you on the ground.
Can you hear me now? Great, wonderful.
Okay, maybe go to Jonathan first. If you go under your volume. Yeah, that's better. Go ahead.
I have a different set of problems, but we'll just go with that. So I think there's a few things. First, in terms of when I'm thinking of abolitionist anthropology, one of the ways that I've seen it circulating a little bit is in a teleological sense, that first we had engaged anthropology, and then we had decolonizing anthropology, and now it's time for abolition. And I think that kind of sequentialness is really different from the way that I am trying to approach abolitionist anthropology. And I'm thinking definitely about Abolushi Ghosh and Tahir's response to Ryan when they ask for us to broaden and provincialize our approach to anthropologies. And so I think part of that broadening and provincializing is really understanding what is the decolonizing impulse when it's oriented around the mainland United States, right? And so for me, an anthropology of abolition is one that is committed to unthinking the state, not just the set of apparatuses and structures, but the state of affairs as it is, right? Which I think we know a little bit more about unthinking the nation, right, than we do about unthinking governance as we are in it right now. And I want to turn to the chat a little bit because one of the most cogent things that came out of the YouTube chat, which I've been trying to follow and tack back and forth with, is really thinking about Puerto Rico in particular as a place to think from and be from anthropologically. Of course, you know, Jonathan opened us up with the Grito de Lares, and I think for me as a non-Puerto Rican and also non-sovereign subject, it means so much to what would it mean to shift our center of gravity to Ponce, to San Juan, to the island of Puerto Rico, and really understand from that vantage point the ongoing genocides, franchise colonialism, settler colonialisms that do imbue San Jose, Djibouti City, San Juan all at the same time. And so I think that the kinds of relocating of a center of gravity are really productive at this moment. And I'm also wondering if there's ways that we can use that kind of shifting to allow us to be clearer about our own affective investments, right? And so we know that there's no flag that will represent liberation for all of us, right? So an anthropology for liberation is inherently not going to be a national one. And I'm also hoping that an abolitionist anthropology can really attune us to our own affective relationship with destruction and decay and death. Because part of what we skip over in the fix is the grief process. And at a moment when death from coronavirus, from ongoing state violence, from patriarchal violence that kills women in their own homes with no headline to speak of at all, gets fixed so quickly, we are not necessarily attuned. We know more about how to observe other people grieving than we do about our own grief processes. And so I would just think about the capacity for anthropology as a site of grief, not just to observe grief, but as an actual grief practice in the New World.
Great, thanks for that. Jonathan, give us some final reflections on the ways you imagine and have enacted an anthropology that you feel is transformative. What methodological strategies, what ideological, theoretical retunings?
It's completely unfair, Deb, so thank you very much for turning to me. I will say I've followed some of the chat as well to get a sense of some of the things that people are asking about, particularly around radical humanism and what Ryan might have meant by that, what we might mean by that, and what that could mean for anthropology. I was struck by Zoe's comments about edgelessness, and I wanted to think about that in relation to radical humanism. And Zoe's quoting Tiffany King's book, The Black Shoals. There's another concept that Tiffany King uses in The Black Shoals, or develops in The Black Shoals, which is plasticity. And she's thinking about edgelessness, not just in terms of the relationships between different historical moments, between different populations, different modes of violence and dispossession, I guess I think her conceptualization of plasticity was really striking to me because of her analysis of how power can transform the materiality of the world and can link things together in ways, can constitute the meaningfulness of the very forms of reason that I think Savannah was speaking to earlier, that get privileged or institutionalized and become very consequential for populations in various ways. So in terms of, you know, what radical humanism looks like in relation to these questions about plasticity and edgelessness, for me, what's involved is attending to ways of being that have always been in existence, forms of relationality that have always been in existence, but that we haven't developed careful tools for observing, at least as a discipline. Now, that's not to say that various populations haven't developed tools for observing these forms of humanism, these ways of being. And this is, I think Sylvia Wynter's name has been referenced on multiple occasions to kind of say, we are continually tethered to this notion of what the subject is that we're observing and making sense of. Whereas various people, whether it's Christina Sharp or Catherine McKittrick or Alexis Pauline Gumbs or, you know, Saidiya Hartman have asked us to attend to ways of being that we have not been, that we haven't centered in our work. That raise different kinds of questions about who humans are, what our responsibility is to one another's survivance and to the ecologies that we're a part of. And so I guess that's the work that I'm most interested in this moment. What's it look like for us to collectively develop tools for perceiving those different kinds of, that different kind of humanism that Winter was asking us to conceptualize, to think about, to be able to make sense of. So that's where I am with this. And it doesn't resolve things in any straightforward way, but it helps to open up some possibilities for me that I found productive to kind of think about how there are aspects of this world that we've sort of taken for granted as settled that have never been settled. And so what's it look like for us to kind of reorient, to reorient to their dynamism and to think about the violence that's associated with that dynamism, but also the possibility.
Thanks, Jonathan. That's actually the question from the chat that I was going to pull in as well. And to take it one step further, and not for any of us to answer necessarily now, but you know, the critique of liberal humanism is so important. And I think given the formulations of the subject, the formulations of governance that are so embedded within liberal humanist philosophy, it actually bears asking whether a radical humanism is even possible. Kamari, I'll turn it over to you for some reflections.
Okay, thank you, Deb. And it's hard to believe that 2 hours has just fled by. So let me just offer some thoughts and really to say that there are a number of things for the future that we've already started to think about. But the discussion today, of course, calls on us to critique or to take on liberal humanism. It raises a question that Ronaldo Walcott recently asked, which was, how do we and what do we owe each other? And in many ways, this question asks us to ponder a different future for the discipline and a different way of thinking about anthropological practice. And so the case for letting anthropology burn is a case and a call for abandoning anthropology's liberal suppositions. As we've said and as we've seen, it's a call to adopt a radical humanism at its political horizon. And it's quite clear in this moment that COVID-19 demands for racial justice, abolishment of structures of violence, defunding the police, cops off campus. They're not just topics of trendy topics of study or the topics that we use to build our careers and livelihoods, but this moment has made bare how the demand for disciplinary change is actually tied to a demand for our survival. It's about our ability to know ourselves, to know each other, and our need to be able to teach and engage and render relevant and valuable and intelligible the lives of people who, as we remember Eric Wolf's work, he referred to as the people without history. And so what we hear today is that this turn to a radical humanism involves abandoning particular divisions, including the division between theory and practice, social change, categories, conceptual change. Many of these things have emerged from the chat and from our interlocutors on the panel, an insistence that we abandon and rethink classical Western ontologies, approaches to anthropological training. But what's clear, and I think what has invigorated this conversation, is the metaphor of burning, but also a recognition that burning also produces kindles that then rekindle. And the question has to do with when the rekindling happens, and as it's happening in the midst of the fissures, what are the spaces within which this takes shape and should take shape? What are the places within anthropology and elsewhere? And so it's true that anthropology has contributed to many things related to 20th century thought. Here, thinking about 21st century thought, moving from our histories of rejecting evolutionary science, fighting fascism and scientific racism, as we know from our discipline, rethinking categories of gender, class categories, calling for the decolonization of anthropology. All of these things certainly are part of our past and our present, but clearly today I think we have a long way to go. And so I think one of the questions to end with is to keep us going, as we think about the kindling fire and the fires at large, is, can the fires be redirected? Can the flames form the kindling that forms new domains for thought, including having humanism as its roots? What do we owe each other? And I think these are the kinds of questions that underline the challenges today, and that we hope to use to keep the conversation going. One of the ways is through the hashtag Should Anthropology Burn, recognizing the spirit around the invocation of the burn, but also pointing you to the recent Public Anthropology's commentary that came out yesterday. There were 4 contributors to that Public Anthropology commentary on American anthropologists, and we invite you to take a look at those that are responding to Ryan's piece, but also that invoke and push us to think in multiple innovative and important directions. And we ask you those of you who are part of this conversation, to feel free to submit reflections and to engage in that discussion, because I think it's not just our discussion, it's the disciplines, but it goes well beyond the discipline. And so we invite you to do that. And also we finally want to be able to carry this conversation forward in Sapiens, on sapiens.org, Wenner-Gren's forum. So those are 3 of the domains for continuing the conversation. We want to thank you all, the panelists. Thank you very much for your engagement. Of course, thank the co-sponsors, the Department of Anthropology at UCLA, as well as the Wenner-Gren Foundation. Thank you, Danilyn, Jason, for your support. And then thank you all, all of you who have contributed comments and participated in the discussion. Thank you. We hope we can continue this conversation with you all at another time moving forward. So thanks again, and good night.